Okay. All right. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Peah Perek Aleph Halacha Hey. God willing, concluding this chapter and beginning Perek Beis Halacha Aleph. We're going to be learning today Daf Tez Zayin. We left off on Daf Tez Vav Amid Beis, 2 dots, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid. But before we give a recap for today's Daf, I want to go back and quickly review. Either I did not say it correctly, or I think I did not say it correctly, the second version in the beginning of yesterday's daf. And this is very important. There was a machlekes how to learn the Gemara. The first version, and throughout Masechtas Peah, we're going to follow the first version. We hold that Trumais Umaisres, none of that needs to be separated from Peah. And the Chiddush of the Mishnah was that Bamed Dvarim Amurim, that you left Peah as you should have. But the moment you left Peah after the Miruach, if that's what happened, since when the Miruach happened, there was a Chalois Chiyuv of separating Trumos and Maisres. So going forward, Trumos and Maisres needs to be removed from the Peah. That was version number 1. Now, what we learned, and version number 1, like we said, was only the Rasharilio. However, the Maharafulda and the and Pnei Moshe and the Ridvaz and others, they understand the following: that actually what the Gemara said is that Maisros does not need to be removed from Peah. Truma has to be removed from Peah. Now, when will the Truma be removed from Peah? That depends. If you leave Peah at the right time on the field, then when the Ani takes it, the Ani doesn't have to give Maisris. The Ani has to remove the Truma Gedoyla. Okay, that was the word. And then even if the Balabas did Meruach, that means, and then he left Peah, weiter the Ani should separate Truma. Truma is going to be separated, but the Ani is not going to be losing out from that anyway. But actually, we learned that if the Balabas did it after the Meruach, if he made the Meruach and then he left Peah, then no matter what, Truma has to be removed. From there, we went to say that Bikurim has to be removed from Peah. Same logic. Just like Truma Gedoyla has to be removed from Peah, Bikurim has to be removed from Peah, and even before the Meruach. In other words, there has to be Bikurim removed from the Peah. Then we said that from Bikurim, you don't have to remove Truma Gedoyla. That was the final conclusion. Why don't we have to remove Truma from Bikurim? Because we had this rule that Kol HaKodim es Chavere, Chavere es Chayev Boy. And since the first obligation is the obligation of Bikurim before anything else, so from the Bikurim, Truma doesn't have to be removed. That was the second girsa of what we learned yesterday. And now let's begin with today's stuff. Now, what we left off, one of the 2 topics that we left off at the end of yesterday's shir, was that if a Kohen and a Levi buy produce after the Miruach, but it wasn't yet tithed, they bought untithed produce, not only do they have to separate the Trumas and Maisres, there's no Chiddush there. The Chiddush of the Mishnah was that there's a Midrabanan that they may not keep it, even though a Kohen can keep Truma, and a Kohen theoretically can receive, not theoretically, a Kohen could receive Maiserishan, but he bought it untithed, he has to separate it and give it to someone else, and we learned that Rabbi Yechanan's explanation, Gemara used the words knas, but the way we explained it is that if they will be able to keep it, then you will only have Kohanim or Leviim buying untithed produce. They will be able to pay a higher number, a higher value, because they get to keep it. And they're going to keep the Trumas Umaisres, which will corner the market in the way that Kohanim and Leviim that are poor will barely, if ever, get Trumas Umaisres. So if they buy untithed produce, they have to separate it and they have to give it to another Kohen and a Levi. What we will start today is a very similar topic, and this will be the whole Daf Tez Zayin. What happens? Same concept. If an Ani buys untithed produce, okay, of course, he has to separate Truma, give it to a Kohen. Maiser Rishon, give it to a Levi or to a Kohen. What about Maiser Ani? Now, truth be told, technically, you don't have every year Meiser Ani, but on the third year of the Shemitah year, of the Shemitah year cycle, on the sixth year, where in the place of Meiser Sheni, you have Meiser Ani. Theoretically, again, you would say that if the Ani, after he separated the Meiser Ani, he did the separation, he gets to keep it. If he's a halach, technically an Ani, so we have here a machlokes tanoim, whether he can keep it and not or not. And based on the Rabbi Yochanan that we just quoted, the Gemara is going to conclude this chapter by explaining a fantastic machlokes tanoim that's contingent whether people lend the money to aniyim or not. And I want to give a Hasidic insight when we learn it inside, because if aniyim will get a loan easily, relatively easily, in order to be able to buy untithed produce, then indeed the logic should be, like Rabbi Yochanan explained the Mishnah, that there should be a midrabanan, that they should not be allowed to keep it. If not, as we'll see, the ones who buy it will get it, and aniyim that don't buy untithed produce will never get meiser ani, as we'll explain. That's going to be the first Amid. Now we're going to begin, God willing, today the second chapter. The second chapter, the Mishnah, is going to be based on psukim that we find regarding payah. We have a loy sechala pa'as sotcha litzor. We have another pasuk that says loy sechala pa'as sotcha bikutzrecha. They both use sotcha in the singular. Don't completely harvest your field in the singular, meaning that each and every field needs to have payah left on it for it, and not, let's go with the rabbinic, I have to leave a 60th. If I have two fields, one might have thought I can harvest one field entirely. A 60th of it would have been 100 pounds of produce. I have another field. From that other field, I'm going to leave 200. In other words, I'm going to leave the right amount, but from one field for all of my fields, the aniyim are not losing. The Torah does not allow for you to do it. We learn it from the word satcha. Every field has to have payah. Question will be, how do you define the field? What type of natural barriers might be running through a field, even though in your mind it's one field? Legally, with the city, it's one property. But as we'll see, certain hefsekim, certain interruptions, can be a path, it can be a ravine, it can be a water canal that you put there to irrigate. Ravine. We're going to get that correction later. That's one of my classic mistakes from the Bavli. We're continuing over here. And all of that, the kids said we're going to learn. And in Nacha detail, we actually mentioned this in the first chapter, that there is a big nafkamina between a grain field, and the same will be by a legume field versus an orchard. By an orchard, is a proper fence. And as we'll as we will unpackage the sugya, that will be the second half of the daf, that will be the second chapter. So jumping back over here, daf tes vav amid base, 3 lines before the bottom of the amid. So guys, halk up this whole logic that a kohen or a levi who buy untithed produce, when they separate, which of course they have to, if not it's going to be tevel, they cannot keep it. And let me just go over the numbers. Let's say a guy has 100 apples. Let's say wholesale would be 100 zuz. No one is going to pay 100 zuz if it's untithed, because the buyer has to separate. Let's just begin with Truma and Ma'aser Rishon, right? 2, and then around 10. Let's say 12. So he'll pay wholesale. If the Kohen and Levi would get to keep it, they'll pay 82 zuz. They're not going to pay the whole price. They're going to pay more than the other guys would pay. Why? Because the Kohen will keep the other 12. The whole thing. He's a Kohen. And who cares? Who cares? Because then it's going to come out that only the Kahanim and Leviim that are wealthy will be the ones ending up with all the Trumas U'Maisros, and no one else will receive it. That's not fair. So that's the way Rabbi Yochanan explained the Mishnah. Now we're moving on, Me'inyan Le'in, but you have to remember this, Rabbi Yochanan. What's the Nu'inyan? Ma'aser Ani, same thing. Again, what's going to happen if an Ani buys untithed produce? I know the first 2 and the next 10 he has to give away to Kohen or a Levi. But then there's another 10 around. Even though this is not accurate what I'm saying, because the 10% that you give to the Levi is not from 100, some 98. How much do you have now? First of all, you don't give 10. So you have more than, you have like 89 or 80. From that, you give 10%. But I'm just rounding up the numbers. The next 10 on the third year and on the sixth year is Meiser Ani, which means that really the guy that buys it, if he's not a Kohen and not a Levi and not an Ani, he only gets to keep 78. So he would pay 78. The Ani would pay 82. If the Ani would be allowed to keep for himself. Question is, could he or could not? Machlokes Tanoi. Let's read it inside it. Tani, we learned in a Brais. Before we go on, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, guys, isn't Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi? Rabbi is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So there are two approaches here. And for my Hasidic insight, which might be wrong, but for it to be right, I'll have to go with the second. The first one is just to know that Rabbi is Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Rabbi Yehuda Nisi'ah, as we know throughout, right, the Gezeit of Shemen, who was Mevatel the Gezeit of Shemen Akum, Rabbi Yehuda Nisi'ah was his grandson. So, and even though that in the Bavli, Rabbi Yehuda Nisi'ah is written with a hey at the end, they don't have it here. Let me go with another version. The other version is instead of it saying Rebbe, as the Sfardim know from their Zemiras, is a title that you give to any great person. Biribi. So the Biribi, that when the Braisa was put down on paper, Danny, we forgot who. We knew it was some great Tana. Biribi. The second opinion is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. We're going to go with that. The compiler of the Mishnah. What's the machlokes? Let's begin. Before the Braisa tells you where they argued regarding Meiser Ani, I already gave you the heads up whether the Ani can keep it after he separates it. The Braisa begins by telling you where there is no disagreement. Rule number one, that if halakeya peiros michobarim and hagoy, if you buy peiros that are attached to the ground from the goy, everyone agrees that when you, the Yid, buys it, harvests it, and makes the meruach, shehein chayavin b'maisres. This is extremely important. There are those who hold, chevre, that the ownership of the goy in the land of Israel is so deep that whatever grows on his land will always be exempt of Trumas Maisres. Not Biribi nor Rabbeinu HaKadosh agree with it. Which means that even though the goy owns it, a goy really doesn't own the land. So therefore, his ownership is not real ownership. It cannot exclude the land from the obligation of Trumas Maisres. But make no mistake, a goy is not obligated to mitzvahs. And therefore, the land has to be tithe. But if he owns it, which he does, which is legal, and then he harvests, and then the goy does the meruach, if at the moment of the meruach, it belonged to a goy is not chayiv in giving Trumas Maisres. If at that moment there was a ptur, even if a Jew buys it later, there won't be a new chiyuv. It's about who owned it by the meruach. So if you bought it before the meruach, you're chayiv. Everyone agrees with that. Next, everyone agrees with Ba'al Shal Yisrael Shenichnas Tachtov. Now here, there's different ways of understanding what the Braisa means. Let's go with the second interpretation of the Marafulda, which is the second to last and the last line in the Amid. Lish Nachnina Shenichnasu, not Shenichnas, but Shenichnasu, meaning Peiros HaMichubarim, to a Jew, that they were bought by the Goy. The Goy was the one that did the Meruach. Also, it will be exempt. Same concept. In other words, even if there is a theoretical potential of an obligation of Trumas Maisres, no matter who owns it, B'shas Meruach, if it belongs to a Yid, even though it grew by a Goy. The other way around, if it grew in B'sdei Yisrael, but when the Meruach came, then the Goy owned it, the Goy did the Meruach. It's not about him doing it, it's about him owning it when it was done, then it's going to be exempt. No one debates with that. Learning to daf, tezayin on the top. Va'al halikeach peiros telushin min hagoy. Okay, in the case where it grew by a goy, the goy harvested it, the goy did the meruach, weiter shehem peturos min hamaisres. So you understand why not everyone said the second version, because it's really going to be the same. The difference will be, did the Jew buy it when it's attached, before the meruach, after the meruach? It's all the same. What we do know, there's a machlekes between Biribi and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. What's the argument? You bought peiros. That guys, it grew. It's not about grew by a Jew. The meruach was done by a Jew, which means it's now tevel, which means it has to be tithed. The moicher did not tithe it. Okay, so now the lekeach has to tithe it. What happens if the lekeach is an ani? The same. Does he for sure has to separate the ma'aser ani? The question is, does he have to give it to another? Like we learned in the Mishnah that a kohen or a Levi, right, when they buy it after the meruach, they have to give that to other kohanim and Leviim, or ani is different. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi Omer, we're going to go with again the second understanding that's Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Echad ani ve'echad asher motzin miyadoi. In other words, he is not allowed to keep it for himself. He has to give it away. Okay? Now, everyone agrees, guys, that if an ani owns land, before you jump to ask if an ani owns land, how is he an ani? I'm not going to answer that right now. It's Shaykh. But if an ani owns land, all right, that's l'kul alma. You can't not tithe ma'aser ani. There's no question about it. It has to be separated. Point is, he has to give it. Rabbi or Biribi Yomer, some great Tana says, no, only an usher not only has to separate also ma'aser ani and give it away, he's an usher, but ani ain't motzin miyadoi. Narvas, the ani can keep it himself. So now you get the whole amit. No, the question will be, why will Biribi not compare an ani to a kohen and a Levi? And based on the explanation we gave yesterday, that the reason why kohen and Levi has to give it away, because if not, they're going to corner the market. Maybe it's not shaykh for an ani. That's what we're getting to, because what are you worried about? The ani is an ani. If an ani doesn't have money, it's very rare for an ani to buy it. So for something that's rare, we don't care about. That will be ultimately where we get it. But let's begin. My time that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Okay. Shame. She'ein adam zoicha b'leket shikhopeya shaloi. And everyone will agree to that. Okay. And how do we know that? No, it's if you're an ani and you own land, how do you know that you can't take your own leket shikhan peya? Look inside the top maraf folder, the second one on the Amit, because it says, he's quoting psukim, where it says, it says like this, he doesn't quote the whole pasuk. The whole pasuk reads, the leket ketzircha loisa laket, the leket ketzircha, you cannot gather it, le'oni velager hazav oisam. So you know what we say? We say, v'leket ketzircha loisa laket, even if you're an ani. That's the drasha. Not, don't gather it. Your harvest, don't gather. Who am I, God, saying it to? To you, the ani. Means even the ani has to leave it. You can't say, I'm an ani. Why should I leave? Okay, let's begin with that. So just like we know that to be by leket and by shikhan peya, we all compare one to the other. The Torah most times puts them together. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says that he has to give it away. Now, very good. My time of the Rebbe. Now, Rebbe or Biribi for sure agrees that an ani has to leave leket shikha and peya for other aniyim. So he says you cannot compare leket shikha and peya. You cannot compare that to ma'aser ani. And there's a big difference. The big difference is like this. Once the meruach happens, there isn't only a din that you have to give tzedakah to the ani, matnas aniyim. There is that also. But when it comes to trumas or maisers, which includes maiser ani, does not include leket, not shikha, not peya, truma, maiser rishon, maiser sheni, or maiser ani. Once you have to do it, if you didn't, that produce is called tevel, and if you eat it, you're chayv misa b'dei shamayim. If a person did not leave leket or did not leave peya, it's not called tevel. They have to. There's a chayv on them, but the produce is not prohibited, which is a raya. That will be the under logic over here. That in the untithed produce, in it, you already have the ma'aser ani. Because if the ma'aser ani would not be in it, that's the way we're going to learn it. Then why would it be prohibited? If it's only a chayv as gavra. Leket shikhan peya, after you separated it, it's not separated. Prior to which, we don't consider it to be in it. Therefore, we'll see it. Let's read it inside. Since ein toivlim, prior to its separation, we don't consider what you have to be tevel. You're not going to be chayv misa b'dei shamayim. We cannot consider those gifts. We cannot consider what you have to contain in them, the gifts. And therefore, that's the key. That is a raya that we view ma'aser ani to be present in the untithed grain. Now, what is Rabbi and Biribi arguing about? Where you bought it. When you bought it, that means the moicher rishon, the owner rishon, the moicher, he did the meruach. We're saying that in there's already an obligation for it to be given away. You bought it when that obligation was already in it. I'm sorry. The opposite. The ma'aser ani was already in it.
It's like it was tithed already.
And therefore you bought it.
Don't a lot of normally sell tevel or sell?
Yeah. Yeah. In other words, he's giving up a mitzvah. He's giving up a mitzvah, but it makes no difference because, in other words, if people want to buy it, they'll buy it. They have to know. Yeah. No, you can't sell it to Kohanim because even for the Kohen, prior to separating Ma'aser Rishon and Ma'aser Sheni or Ani, it's called Tevel.
I actually separate. You have to give it to
the truma you have to give, but untithed produce, that's what I was explaining. Untithed produce. So if you would pay wholesale one per apple, if it's untithed, a buyer would only pay 78. He wouldn't pay more money because the 22 will have to give away. Okay. So let's go over here. So that's the one. That since it's already considered to be in it, so it's as if it's separated already. He bought it. He gets to keep it. Ukvar nitbal achu b'rishus shel rishon. It's gavaldik.
Why is it any different?
It's a very different because the one who's mechuyev has to give it to an ani. We're going to view that the seller gave it to the buyer. The buyer is an ani. If it's not even considered to be in it, the Torah saying befedish that with this hekish that the leket considered cholei salaked lo ani. An ani has to leave it. Say that the guy, you always have to leave it. He left it already. He already left it and he gave it to the lekeach. Invite him. I know the Gemara is coming there. We just said it. Now let's go back. This is so good. It's given. It was already in it. So the one who harvested gave it to the buyer. So he says, you're right, Danny. That's the word. Yes. Really, the ani can keep it. Everyone midoi raisa. Like we said, midoi raisa, a coin who buys untithed produce, midoi raisa, after he separates it, he should get to keep it. What did we say yesterday? Why does he not get to keep it because of a knas? The pshat of a knas is not that he did anything wrong. The chachamim are penalizing, making sure that if you buy it, if it was untithed, you have to give it to someone else, like we said, by the coin. Because a kohen who would get to keep it, as he gets to keep it, midoi raisa, they'll be the only ones buying untithed produce. Why will they be the only ones? Because they can afford to pay more than everyone else. Everyone else will only get to keep 78. So he won't pay 12 for it. He'll pay 6 for it. He'll pay 4. He'll pay more than other people. And who cares? I'll tell you who cares. Because then it's going to come out at the end that the ruba of Ma'aser and Truma will remain only in the hands of wealthy Kohanim. And we wanted it to be spread about. Now let's see if it's shaykh over here. Forget about it. Ani. Let's go to Ani. So, now once again. So now my Talmud the Rebbe. So Rebbe says, "I'll tell you, perfect. I love you. I agree. Knas is only shaykh by Kohanim and Levim that could be wealthy. Asher yesh biyadei likach. So we have that concern. Ani ain't biyadei likach. He's an ani. So how possible is it? How common will it be for an ani to buy produce? Barely. So the one time that he buys it, that's the word. Ani was already in the untithed produce. the harvester, the meruach one, has to give it. He gave it by selling it. He gave it. I only aniyim. Why will aniyim buy it? Aniyim barely can buy it. So what about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi? So it comes out, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi Yomer Matzihu Lilvois. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi holds he's taking ani. How does he have money to buy it? He borrows money. Will people lend money to an ani? Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi holds that people will lend money to an ani. Biribi holds that ain't Matzi Lilvois. And I'm insisting on Biribi and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, because that's the word of Anasi B'Yisrael. Think about it. That's the whole concept, that Anasi is Nitzu Shal Yaakov Avinu. That means that he is someone that has an extraordinary amount of Avos Yisrael. Who would lend money to an ani?
Very well.
He is wealthy, but for the wealthy people that I know, the wealthier they are, the more careful they are with the money. They give less donations. The people, the Amcha, they give money. Oh, and the reason why they're wealthy are wealthy, and that doesn't work that way. But that's the word that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So it's not a machlekes and metzias. It depends. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi himself would lend money to the poor, and therefore he doesn't view the poor as someone who doesn't have. Gewaldig. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi would give him the good business plan. We're going with the second interpretation. I'm saying it's not my whole part wouldn't work. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, because the tzaddik of the generation, he's the one that has a certain understanding that he would lend money to an ani, which he would, because he's a nasi. Okay, now Yidden. It says, Sotcha means, as the Gemara is going to say, that every field has to have its own payer removed, even though, guys, the ani is never going to lose. I mean, like by Truma. By Truma, we say that you can give Mina Mukaf. Remember that? What's Mina Mukaf? As long as the two, let's go to Challah. If you have two doughs, if they are together because they're touching, Lechatchila, Mina Mukaf, have to separate midrabanan 2%. Let's go 1/50th. So instead of giving 2%, as long as they are both equal product, both equal quality, both equal obligation, I can give 4% from here and give nothing from here. If they are together, we don't say that by pay. Not because by pay it's not shaykh min hamukaf. No, because there's a sotcha. Every field has to have its own pay. A thought came into my mind. I know someone that for every sale he gave tzedakah from that sale. Think about that. We're talking about ma'aser ksafim. Really, you could have given at the end of the month. What was however you make your cheshbon and give ma'aser ksafim. Like from everything you give ma'aser. Like by pay, it has to be that way. Not because it's going to be more or less. So now the question is, and this Mishnah is not speaking about an orchard. We are only speaking about a grain field. We're speaking about a legume field. We're speaking about vegetables. I'm not going to mention vegetables because most vegetables are perishable. We learned in the previous chapter from the 5 conditions, but the ones that are not perishable, because Ruba, the people, will dry them out. So ve'elu mafsikim lepeyam, nachal, machloikes. Either nachal means a stream, a natural stream of water, or nachal means a ravine, not a raven. A ravine. The problem with the ravine will be in a moment, then it might appear the Mishnah is repeating itself, but let's go. So therefore, we're going to go with the stream, a natural stream, bahashilulis, and a irrigation canal, man-made. So you think about the whole irrigation canal was put by the balabas to irrigate. No, the irrigation canal, if it goes through the field, then every side is considered a field for itself. On the base. Something called the derech and something called the shvil. Nowadays, you would say a derech is something that's paved, a shvil is a path, but that's not the meaning. In the Mishnah, they have no paving. Derech means a road, shvil means a path. So we're going to go with the pshat. Derech HaYachid is a road. Yachid, because, how is it expressed? It's 4 amas wide. We're going to go with that. And Derech HaRabim, as we have according to some, when it comes to the whole sugi of Eruvin, a path that has 16 amas of width. Now, what happens if you have something that is between 4 amas and 16 amas, which is very common even today? 16 amas is very wide. That's the way we'll tie shvil. There are many other approaches. Shvil hayachid will be something that's not even 4 amas. That's the way we'll learn. And shvil harabim means it's taka. You can't say it's a public road. It's not 16 amas, but it's more than 4 amas. Okay, derech and shvil. The next line of the Mishnah only goes to shvil. Only goes to shvil. When it comes to a derech, I don't care if it's not used the entire year. When it comes to a shvil, then says the Mishnah, what type of shvil will halachically divide the field into 2 halves? Only hakavua if it's used both b'maisachama and b'maisachshamim, but if it's not used year around and it's only a shvil, then it's not mafsik. Masha'en kein a derech, and we're going to go even a derech hayachid. It's even if it's not used the whole year, it's mafsik. Next, now a bur is a field that was completely left fallow. The challenge with the nachal as a ravine is, how is that different than the bur? And maybe it's not. In other words, ravine is naturally not plantable, and here, even if it's plantable, but it's the same nekuda. Pasha machlek is what nachal means. Whenever you have a mishnayos, nachal, it's a very different thing. Other is a machlek is how to interpret it. Nir is a field that was plowed, but it was not planted. And if you remember from the cheskas habatim, it was very common that people would give a break, but they would dafka plow it. No, it's plowing. Plowing awakens the koyach, and then not seeding it allows it to regain its nutrients. In life, many times we go through plowing. Plowing is all the gevura we get. God is plowing into us, and so there's nothing's coming out. Even better. That's a chaim. Amen. It's coming. It should not be. We should be in a good year. Now, v'zera acher is very difficult. V'zera acher means that it's not one type. We got a problem. Let me tell you the problem that we're going to learn in Masechtas Kalayim. Masechtas Kalayim, we're going to learn that if you're planting kilei zeroim, we mentioned it in the last chapter. Kilei zeroim, kilei akerem is not only kerem. There's kilei akerem, people get, and then there's kilei zeroim, which means I'm not allowed to plant. If I have land and I want to plant wheat and barley, I cannot plant them back to back. Kalayim, kilei zeroim. I have to leave a fallow in between. The Mishnah already said bur. The Mishnah already said nachal. So it's not because of zera acher. That's the kasha. The teretz will be, and we're going to learn this in Masechtas Kalayim, and we learn Ambam, hopefully. And one of the biggest chidushim that we find by Kalayim is that there is nowhere else in the Torah where Maras Ayin has biblical importance other than in Kalayim. Maras Ayin, whenever the Chazal said to say it, because Emo Davar Soif, if we're going to say it on our own, is always a rabbinic. Something normally is allowed, Maras Ayin, don't do it. People will think and they'll do what you're doing. Maras Ayin is not chshad. Chshad means people are going to think you're sinning. Maras Ayin is not that. That's chshad. Maras Ayin means people know that you're a Jew that's obedient, you're keeping the mitzvahs, and they're going to think you're doing something that's prohibited, and they're going to say, if you're doing it, I'm going to do it. No, you're influencing people the wrong way. By Kalayim, we're going to learn. We learned it, and we should learn, keep on chazening, is that there are many times that when people look, they see it's not together, that you can plant it one all the way to the other. For example, instead of you planting patches that are in the same direction, one patch is being planted from east to west, and the other branch is being planted 90-degree angle. So it's like a triangular. Remember those Chayenu pictures? So you have a patch that is a square, and then you have, if we're allowed to use this, the other patches like this. So when people look at it, they see it's separate, not patches like this. Like this, whoever sees the picture. In other words, there are certain configurations which will allow in one part for one part to go all the way up until the other. So there is no bur. Nevertheless, since it is zera acher, still considered separate. You can't say they're touching. I don't care that there's no other space. It's two different seeds. Next is, and this is like with animal food, sometimes you're going to give the same grain that you are growing for people, you're going to use that for your animal food. But animals don't need to eat such good food as people. Not the animals of LA, the old animals. So what they did is that they would harvest it prior to it being ripe. And that is called shachas. So think about it. If someone went ahead, they had a field of grains, one zera, but they in this one place in the middle, in Mitten, they decided they're going to take for their animal. They have animals. So they're going to harvest here. That's called shachas. HaKoitzer l'shachas, mafsik, but that's already only the opinion of Rav Meir. Why? What's the other? The other logic will be, if I planted grain, if everything that was growing is good quality, Elama, I chose to harvest it early. Harvesting one place early, like B'chlal Vakasha. Imagine a person, forget about shachas. You want to harvest the field for humans, and today you only harvested this half. So this half now is empty. Are we going to say, from this half I have to leave payah, and then from the other half I have to leave payah, because right now this is empty and this is full? We don't say that. It's one act of harvesting. That's the shit of the Chachamim. That you can't say that just because you harvested a part in middle of the underdeveloped grains that it's mafsik. It's the beginning of the harvesting. Ain't a mafsik. Now, if you harvested shachas and you plowed, now you have two separate fields. So, ain't a mafsik elam kein charash. So let's begin. Says the Mishnah, Gemara is quoting the Mishnah. Elu mafsikim, elu mafsikim lepayim. And we already said Baal Peh. What's the source of that? Why can't I say that as long as the ani is getting from everything that I grew a 60 is, the ani is not losing out, why every field has to have its own payah? More says Gzeres HaKosov. Sheneman, as it says, Satcha, says that actually a few times. From there we learn, we're going to take out the word Bilvad. Shelo yoitzi misada lechavertom. Look inside the Mara folder. Satcha, mashma lechayiv al kol Sada b'fnei atzmam. And I want to add something just to connect something we learned here and something that we learned at the end of the first chapters. When we spoke about this idea that what's the logic? Why is it that leket, peya, and shikha has to be left, has to be left to another ani? Masha enkin meiser ani. We're saying that midoy raisa, if the ani buys the untithed produce, because it was already, in other words, when it comes to matnas aniyim, is it a chiyuv gavra or is it also a chiyuv chefza? That's ultimately the question. And if it's a chiyuv gavra, which is a case of peyo, which is untithed, then there's even a bigger logic, understand the opposites, to say that you don't have to leave from every field. We want for the person to be habituated in giving matnas aniyim. That's why you need. Nevertheless, it doesn't make it into tevel. Not that the field has in it a mixture, and until you separate the peya, you're messed up. We don't say that. If you b'chlal didn't separate peya, you violated the mitzvah, which, by the way, you can pay back up until when you baked it and you ate it, and there's nothing. It's kosher. It's not a chiyuv chefza. Chiyuv gavra, like b'chol yom v'yom avad aviditi, the Alter Rebbe says. Like if a person has an option, they're going to give $365 a year tzedakah. Give it one time, or you give it every day. You give it every day because you are imbuing that day with kedusha. It's like it's a chiyuv on me, but what's the chiyuv on me to imbue every shtickle of field? Every field I know from it, the ani benefited. Dira b'tachtoinim. We'll stop over here. I know we have another few minutes, but the whole opening now, it goes until into the next stuff.
Can I just ask a question on the previous one where we don't say the same thing about a goody?
Fair.
It's that it's not fair. That someone like that owns it.
No one benefits. If the guy owns.